This video is going to walk you through some ideas from my book called The Heresy of Heresies, a defense of Christian common sense realism. And this section is 3.4.2 from chapter 3 on Edith Stein's interior path of existence. It's a kind of a longish critique in this part of the chapter of the notion that non-being is real. We can encounter it. Sorry, it's hard to say this with a straight face. Heidegger seems to want to get God involved with not being. I think that's a major mistake. He says this from his, this is Heidegger again, what is metaphysics? Christian dogma gives a twist to the meaning of nothing, so that it now comes to mean the absolute absence of all being outside of God. And I think there's something wrong with this. There's nothing to non-being. Just put it that way. Okay. So now someone might take a scriptural passage and try and justify this to connect it to Heidegger's view. If I'm understanding Heidegger correctly, that might be a big if there. But there's a passage from the scripture that we might need to take into consideration. So in the book of Romans, chapter 4, verse 17, in his discussion of faith and grace in the life of Abraham, the Apostle Paul says this, as it is written, quote, I have made you, Abraham, a father of many nations, quote. He is our father, that's Paul quoting the scripture. He is our father in the sight of God, in whom he believed, the God who gives life to the dead and calls into being things that were not. That's Romans, end quote. That's Romans 4:17. So the context here is Abraham and his faith that he had in God regarding the promise of his son Isaac, and that God would use that promise to fulfill a greater promise of faith in making Abraham a father of many nations. But the kind of God who could do that is what I want to focus on here. Okay, so the kind of God in whom Abraham had faith is a God who can give life to the dead. The context here speaks of Abraham and Sarah's old age and their barrenness, right? They were quite old. And it also looks ahead to the resurrection of Jesus and ultimately all those who have faith. But in addition to being a God who can give life to the dead, he can do this because he's a God who calls into being things that were not. That's the quotation there from Romans. So the context here is the calling into being of an heir for Abraham, namely Isaac, whom God has promised to Abraham. God promises Abraham an heir, and God carries out his plan, as God is wont to do. So Abraham has faith, which is, to quote Greg Koukl here from his book called The Story of Reality, faith is a step of trust to rely on what we have good reason to believe is so, or is real, if you want to add that to it. So the most relevant part of the verse here is calls into being that which was not. So let's look at this in light of the discussion that we've had so far of the problem of non-being that I'm looking at in Stein, and Heidegger seems to go full bore on. So following Stein, it seems that you could view things that were not as things which have non-being. Okay, so when the scripture says that God calls into being things that were not, the question is, does that mean, does that simply mean something like things that have no being, right? Things that have no being. Well, that is, the non-being of these things is something from which God causes things to be, right? That's the question. Is the non-being of things that are not, that by means of which God causes things to be. However, if Aquinas is right, which we looked at in the previous video, then the notion here is one of order, not of cause, right? So there's an order that is from X prior to something existing, God brings it into existing. Okay? So when God calls Isaac into being, for example, he doesn't use something that is not, that is, has non-being, as a means, either material or efficient, to cause Isaac to exist. Rather, God calls Isaac into being in a temporal order, in an order of time, okay? Or maybe an order of metaphysics, or metaphysical time, if you want to put it that way. But it's not an order of causation. Okay. So once Isaac was not, but now Isaac is it's important to remember that even the notion that Isaac was not doesn't mean that Isaac, the promised son of Abraham and Sarah, was like floating around somewhere in waiting to be exemplified. That would be absurd, because then he would have to exist. Now, you might think, well, he existed as a thought in God's mind or something like that. But he didn't exist. The thought existed. Isaac didn't exist prior to Isaac's existence. He came into being, ex God's power, from God's power, not from some non-being. Just got to make that very clear. Non-being is not real. So Aquinas comments Aquinas comments on this passage. So that's kind of interesting to me. In the Summa twice. The first time he's talking about God's foreknowledge, and he cites this on the sed contra section of that question 14, article 9 in primum pars of the Summa. And he says this: Aquinas claims that although Isaac is not actual before God causes him to exist, God foreknows Isaac and is able to make his promise about Isaac. So it's an issue of foreknowledge here, not of some non-being of Isaac. It's through his act of understanding, so this is quoting here from the Summa, it's his, quote, act of understanding, which is his being, as God's being, and is measured by eternity. The present glance of God extends over all time and to all things which exist at any time, as to objects present to him. Okay, so it has to do with God's eternal foreknowledge. Now, I'm not an expert on that, but that's something that can apply here, that allows for God's creation X, that is in a temporal order from eternity, that indicates that God is not using non-being in any causal way. Okay. God simply foreknows Isaac and calls Isaac into being at the right time in order to fulfill his promises to Abraham, who exercises his faith, his act of trust in God for a promised heir. So the second time Aquinas uses this passage is in a discussion of eternal law in the first part of the second part, question 91, article 1, is there divine law? And the first objection here is considered to eternal law, is the idea that there's no eternal law because there hasn't been someone from eternity to impose on it. To impose it on, right? So Aquinas responds to this by saying the following: those things that are not in themselves exist with God, inasmuch as they are foreknown and preordained by him, according to Romans 4:17. That's where he quotes the passage. So since God foreknows what the eternal law will govern in the future outside of himself, there is eternal law even prior to creation. But it has to do with God's foreknowledge, not some kind of mysterious non-being or non-existence that floats around somewhere. Okay. So the metaphysical import of Aquinas' usage of these passages shouldn't be ignored. You can't ignore this. Those things that are not in themselves. Stay psyched, Grom. You.